Here we will read how the tactics of communist subversion and takeover have not changed much. Characteristically cautious, and in any case still maintaining working relations with the Western powers, Stalin thus initially pursued a tactic already familiar from the Popular Front years of the 1930s, and from the communist practice during the Civil War in Spain, favoring the formation of, quote, front governments, coalitions of communists, socialists, and other, quote, anti-fascist parties, which would exclude and punish the old regime and its supporters, but would be cautious and democratic reformist rather than revolutionary. By the end of the war, or very shortly thereafter, every country in Eastern Europe had such a coalition government. It is worth emphasizing that neither Stalin nor his local representatives were in any doubt as to their long-term goal. Coalitions were the route to power for communist parties in a region where they were historically weak. They were only ever a means to an end. Control, in fact, mattered much more than policies. It was not by chance that, in every coalition government, communists sought the control of certain key ministries. The Ministry of the Interior, which gave the party authority over the police and security services, as well as the power to grant and withhold licenses to print newspapers, so control over the flow of information. The Ministry of Justice, with control over the purges, tribunals, and judges. The Ministry of Agriculture, which administered land reforms and redistribution and was thus in a position to confer favors and buy the loyalty of millions of peasants. Communists also put themselves in key positions on, quote, denazification committees, district commissions, and in trade unions. The communist stated objective in 1945 and 46 was to complete the unfinished bourgeois revolutions of 1848 and redistribute property, guarantee equality, and affirm democratic rights in a part of Europe where all three had always been in short supply. These were plausible goals, at least on the surface, and they appealed to many in the region and in Western Europe who wanted to think well of Stalin and his purposes. Their appeal to communists themselves, however, was sharply diminished in a series of local and national elections in Eastern Germany, Austria, and Hungary. There it became very clear, very early, that however successfully they had inserted themselves into positions of local influence, communists were never going to achieve public power through the ballot box. Despite every advantage of military occupation and economic patronage, communist candidates were consistently defeated by representatives of the old liberal, social democratic, and agrarian/smallholder parties. The result was that communist parties adopted instead a strategy of covert pressure, followed by open terror and repression. In the course of 1946 and into 47, electoral opponents were maligned, threatened, beaten, arrested, tried as fascists or collaborators, and imprisoned or even shot. Quote, popular militias helped create a climate of fear and insecurity, which communist spokesmen then blamed on their political critics. Vulnerable or unpopular politicians from non-communist parties were targeted for public opprobrium, while their colleagues consented to this mistreatment in the hope that it would not be applied to them. How familiar does that sound? Following the decimation, imprisonment, or absorption of their main opponents, communists did indeed do rather better at elections in 1947 and thereafter, with some help from violent assaults on their remaining opponents, intimidation at polling stations, and blatantly abusive vote counts. There then typically followed the formation of governments in which the communist or newly united worker or unity party was now blatantly dominant. Coalition partners, if any, were reduced to nominal and empty roles. In keeping with this transition from united front coalitions to communist monopoly of power, Soviet strategy in the course of 1948 and 49 reverted to a radical policy of state control, collectivization, destruction of the middle class, and purges and punishment of real and imagined opponents. This account of the initial Soviet takeover in Eastern Europe describes a process common to all the countries of the region. Stalin's calculations were typically indifferent to national variety. Where communists could reasonably hope to secure power by legal or ostensibly legal means, this appears to have been Stalin's preference, at least in the autumn of 1947. But the point was power, not legality, which is why communist tactics became more confrontational and less embarrassed by judicial or political constraints, even at the cost of alienating foreign sympathy, once it was clear that electoral success would elude them.